Spain, late 15th century. The air still smells of iron and incense. The bells celebrate the fall of Granada, the last Muslim bastion, while the banners of the Catholic monarchs wave under a sun that seems to bless the victory. But that victory did not just bring territories. It brought a vision, a single throne, a single faith, a single obedience. Isabella and Ferdinand believed that the unity of the soul was as necessary as the unity of the sword, and so began a project that would transform devotion into a weapon, faith into a border, and fear into a method of government. The decrees spread like wildfire through the towns. All Jews and Muslims had to convert or leave the Holy Land of Castile. Many accepted baptism, but the rumors never died down. They were called New Christians, although their hands, it was said, continued to light candles at nightfall, and their lips murmured ancient prayers that no priest would understand. Suspicion seeped through the stone walls and mingled with the wind in the squares. Spain became a country of furtive glances, where silence was a form of defense. In 1478, Pope Sixtus IV granted the monarchs the right to create their own tribunal of faith, the Spanish Inquisition. It would not depend on Rome, but on the crown, an almost absolute power wrapped in the mantle of the sacred. In theory, its mission was to save souls. In practice, it would be the laboratory of the most systematic fear in all of Europe. No one was safe. Any word could be evidence. Any gesture, a confession. The border between the divine and the political dissolved. The cross and the crown merged into a single symbol. The first inquisitorial prisons were built in the damp basements of convents. The thick, windowless walls guarded echoes of prayers turned into screams. The Holy Office, as it was called, presented itself as the guardian of spiritual purity, but its methods were profoundly earthly. In its chambers, the soul and the body were judged at the same time. The record spoke of mercy, the body spoke of something else. In the towns, paranoia became a shared language. Neighbors who once shared bread began to watch each other. Who had eaten meat on Good Friday? Who failed to cross themselves when passing the procession? Who closed their windows when the Angelus bells rang? Accusations multiplied like an endless rosary, and every word could become a sentence. An anonymous denunciation was enough to open the dungeon doors. The Inquisition invented a new form of power, that of invisible fear. It did not need armies, only rumors. It did not demand blood in the streets, only submission in the hearts. Every parchment sealed with the emblem of the green cross was a promise of purification, or a condemnation disguised as salvation. In the archives, the phrases were cold and calculated. The accused repented. The prisoner spoke voluntarily. But behind those words were entire nights of darkness, chains, and pain. Over the years, the Holy Office perfected its machinery. The inquisitors studied not only theology, but also the psychology of fear. They knew that a terrified soul speaks more than a tortured body. They knew that imposed silence was more effective than sincere confession. The Inquisition did not just punish, it educated in obedience. It was a school of terror where the main lesson was that truth belonged to power, not to God. And so Spain, proud, resplendent, triumphant, gradually filled with shadows. The palaces were covered with portraits of saints and executioners. The cathedrals resonated with sermons on purity and heresy, while the dungeons oozed dampness and guilt. In that contrast, the true face of the Inquisition was born, not that of the devil, but that of the man convinced he was serving heaven while building his own hell. It all began with a whisper. A neighbor, a servant, a jealous merchant. A suspicion was enough to set the gears in motion. In the squares, the bells called to mass. In the inquisitors' offices, quills scratched on parchment. There, the anonymous denunciation was born, written in trembling handwriting, but carrying the weight of a sentence. No one knew the accuser. No one could defend themselves. In the towns of Castile, Aragon, and Valencia, fear became a currency. To accuse was to survive. The process followed a meticulous, almost liturgical ritual. First came the summons, a parchment sealed with the cross and the motto, Exsurge Domine, Arise, O Lord. Then the interrogation, where the accused was confronted with a series of questions that did not seek answers, but contradictions. Have you prayed unauthorized prayers? Did you ever light candles on Saturday? Have you eaten meat during the fast? Each answer opened a new abyss. Silence, on the other hand, was interpreted as guilt. The inquisitors understood the human soul as a labyrinth that had to be forced to reveal its secrets. They were not irrational monsters. They were bureaucrats of the faith. They wrote with precision, classified, cataloged. Truth was a document, not an experience. Every word of the accused was recorded and signed, while the scribes noted even the gestures. The prisoner trembled, cried, remained obstinate. Faith in that century took the form of a dossier. In the villages, the rumor of an investigation was enough to ruin entire families. Houses were looted, properties confiscated, in the name of the church. The sacred and the economic mixed in a perverse way. The richer the victim, the more visible their heresy seemed. And the inquisitors, financed by the confiscations, needed no other incentive than the very system they had created. Thus, divine justice also became an earthly business. But not everyone surrendered. Some tried to flee to Portugal, others sought refuge in North Africa or in the colonies of the New World. However, the long arm of the Holy Office reached even beyond the sea. Witnesses were bought, letters intercepted, fugitives hunted down. In the sermons, it was said that no one could escape the eye of God. In reality, it was the eye of the Inquisition that never slept. The trials were held in austere rooms with stone walls and makeshift altars. A crucifix presided over the scene, a reminder that every word was heard by Christ himself. The accused had to swear on the Bible to tell the truth, even if that truth led to torment. The tribunal listened in silence, but the verdict was already decided from the first denunciation. The structure of the process did not seek justice, but obedience. Innocence did not matter, only submission. As time passed, fear ceased to be a feeling and became a form of language. People learned to measure their words, to feign devotion, to distrust even their own prayers. In the streets of Toledo or Seville, looking at the ground when a Dominican monk passed by was enough to save one's skin. Silence became a virtue. Faith, a mask. Humanity, a risk. The archives of the time reveal a disturbing detail. Many accused ended up confessing to things they had never done, not out of guilt, but out of exhaustion. After days of confinement, sleep deprivation, and hunger, any mind breaks. Confession became a refuge, lying an escape route. In that sense, the Inquisition not only tortured bodies but also logic. It redefined the truth until it was forced to obey. If one observes that system today, it is clearly seen. It was a perfect machine of social control. It replaced the force of arms with the fragility of conscience. It did not need armies, walls, or life sentences. Only faith and fear. Two elements that, combined, are more powerful than any empire. And like all machines of power, it was not born to disappear, but to transform. Because the Inquisition did not die with its executioners, it changed its face, disguised itself as morality, law, ideology, and it remains alive wherever suspicion is enough to condemn. The true face of power was shown in the basements, where the air was thick and the silence was only broken by the screech of metal. There, beneath the convents and courthouses, the human soul was subjected to the most brutal examination. Among the most used tools was the strappado, a method as simple as it was devastating. The prisoner was tied with their arms behind their back, their wrists bound by a rope that was hoisted over a beam. With a single pull, the body was lifted off the ground, shoulders dislocated, muscles tearing like old fabric. Sometimes, to intensify the torture, weights were tied to the feet, making every breath a battle between flesh and gravity. Chroniclers describe that many of those who survived the strappado never raised their arms again. It was a way of marking the body with the memory of the punishment. The inquisitors considered it a merciful method because it rarely killed. The intention was not to destroy, but to break, to make pain a language of obedience. In the records, one could read, "The accused confessed after the second hoisting. He thanked God for being able to speak." In that phrase, seemingly of mercy, hid the most perverse logic of the Holy Office, that torture could be a form of redemption. But the strappado was not the only test of endurance. There were also the so-called positions of suffering, or postures of penance. They were punishments without iron, without fire, but no less cruel for it. The prisoner had to remain kneeling on stone slabs with arms outstretched in a cross, holding a crucifix or a heavy stone. Every minute was an eternity. The pain began in the muscles but ended in the mind. Others were forced to squat for hours until their legs trembled, their backs arched, and their entire bodies begged for rest. If they fell, the punishment restarted. The Inquisition understood the symbolic value of these postures. They reproduced, in their own logic, the passion of Christ. Suffering was not presented as punishment, but as an imitation of the Savior. Just as he carried the cross, you will carry your guilt. In that blasphemous comparison lay one of the greatest horrors of the system, turning pain into virtue, torment into an act of faith. The prisoner was not only expected to confess, they were expected to be grateful for the opportunity to suffer. Some testimonies preserved in the archives of Valladolid and Zaragoza recount that the inquisitors spoke in an almost paternal tone while adjusting the ropes. They reminded them that the flesh is weak, but the soul is eternal. That the fire of torment purifies like the fire of hell. Only here there was still hope. It was a theological theater where the executioner played the role of the Savior. Pain was offered as a sacrament, confession as communion. And yet the most terrible thing about the strappado and the postures was not the physical pain, but the waiting, the sound of the rope tightening, the cracking of bones before the first pull, the certainty that the next one would be worse. That anticipation, that torture of time, was the most refined tool. In those minutes of absolute silence, the soul was completely stripped bare. It was there, not under the fire that many gave in. The inquisitors knew this. That is why they combined the sessions with intervals of prayer. Psalms were recited between the screams. The Virgin was asked to illuminate the sinner. Sometimes a friar would kneel next to the tortured and whisper, "God is with you, my son. Resist no more." The line between faith and madness blurred, and the prisoner, hanging, dislocated, truly believed that their suffering had a divine purpose. In that instant, the Inquisition achieved the impossible, turning despair into obedience. In the 16th and 17th centuries, the strappado became so common that it no longer caused a scandal. It was a routine, just another step in the procedure. The entire society, from the peasant to the noble, accepted it as a natural part of divine justice. Pain, repeated and normalized, lost its exceptional character. It became a custom. And when pain becomes a custom, compassion dies. Today, looking at those aged ropes and the beams that still survive in some museums in Toledo or Barcelona, one can imagine the echo of those voices. Not only the screams of the tortured, but also the prayers of the inquisitors, convinced they were serving God. Perhaps the most terrifying thing was not the punishment, but the faith with which it was applied. Because nothing is more dangerous than an executioner who believes he is saving souls. Imagine you are in a stone cell, your hands tied, the light flickering like a final comfort. In front of you, the inquisitor recites the accusations: heresy, blasphemy, occult practices. You deny everything. Then he nods slowly and orders the toca to be brought in. It is a soft, almost harmless word, but behind it hides one of the most horrifying torments in history. The prisoner was tied to an inclined bench. A rough cloth was placed over their face, covering the mouth and nose. Then an assistant inserted a small wooden wedge between the teeth to prevent the mouth from closing. Then the water ceremony began. A pitcher was tilted and the liquid descended, little by little, onto the cloth. At first it seemed like a simple baptism, but the water did not bless, it drowned. It entered through the nose, the throat, the lungs. The victim tried to breathe, but every attempt was a new wave of desperation. The inquisitors called it the torment of faith, a way to purify the soul through drowning. In their reports, they wrote phrases like, "The prisoner confessed after 3 pitchers. He was grateful for the opportunity to redeem himself." There was no irony. To them, the water washed away sin like baptism. Only this time, the water brought the truth torn out by fear. It was theology transformed into torture. Unlike fire or iron, the toca left no visible marks. That is why it was perfect. When the prisoner left the chamber, the body appeared intact. Only the trembling, the shortness of breath, and the vacant stare gave away that something inside had broken. It was an invisible torture, the kind that kills slowly from the inside. Near the same room, another tool waited its turn, the garrote vil. At first glance, it seemed more compassionate, a chair, an iron collar, a screw in the back. But it was the final instrument, reserved for definitive sentences. The condemned was seated, their necks secured with a metal ring, and with every turn of the screw, the tip sank into the base of the skull. Sometimes it broke the spine. Other times, it simply crushed the windpipe. A clean death without fire, without spectacle. The garrote was considered Christian, humane. Chroniclers describe it as a method of mercy. There was no smoke or screaming, just a sharp crack. But behind that final calm hid the same logic. Power does not need blood if it already possesses the soul. The garrote was the signature of the Inquisition, the silent seal that certified the victory of fear. However, between the torment of water and the rest of death, there was another instrument, small and perverse, the heretic's fork. It was a simple device, barely two metal prongs joined by a strap that was fastened to the neck. One prong dug under the chin, the other into the chest. It did not kill, it did not bleed. It only prevented the head from moving. Every attempt to tilt it, to sleep, to pray, to cry, caused the prongs to sink deeper. The prisoner had to remain upright, awake, conscious. It was a forced vigil, an endless prayer. The heretic's fork was not intended to extract confessions, but to destroy rest, to race the boundary between night and day. After hours, the body began to tremble. The eyes burned. The mind slipped toward madness. Many begged to speak, not to save themselves, but to be allowed to sleep. In the records, it is read that some died of exhaustion. Others remained alive, but with their gaze fixed on a point, as if they still feared to move. In those basements, the Inquisition reached its most refined degree of cruelty, the absolute control of time. It was not enough to possess the body. The rhythm of suffering had to be mastered. Water for drowning, iron for death, the fork for insomnia. Each instrument had its role in a liturgy of power where the executioner was a priest, torment was a sacrament, and confession, a forced absolution. And when it was all over, silence reigned once again. The inquisitors wrote with clean quills on white parchments. Outside, the town slept. No one heard the echo of dripping water, nor the sigh of someone who could finally breathe. Only the walls knew. And those walls, centuries later, still seemed damp. Not from rain, but from memory. At dawn, the bells called to Mass, but in the square another altar was already being raised, that of punishment. Before an expectant crowd, the executioners prepared the wheel, that instrument that transformed pain into a spectacle. It was a large wooden hoop, the same one used for transport carts, but here it acquired a sacred meaning. The condemned was placed upon it, arms and legs spread as if imitating a crucifixion. Under each joint, the assistants placed wooden blocks. Then the executioner raised an iron bar and struck with precision. First one leg, then the other, then the arms. Every blow broke bones, tore flesh, and raised a murmur among the crowd. It was not an execution, it was a lesson. The victim did not die immediately. Once the body was shattered, they tied it to the wheel, tangling the broken limbs between the spokes. The apparatus was hoisted and fixed onto a pole. There, suspended between heaven and earth, the body became a warning. Dying could take hours, sometimes days. The sun dried the wounds. Birds flocked to it. Some prayed, others cursed. Children watched with fear and fascination. In that scene, religion and cruelty embraced like old accomplices. The auto de fe, the public ceremony where sentences were carried out, was more than a punishment. It was a moral theater. Nobles, friars, and even the kings themselves sat on the balconies. The flames, the wheels, the garrotes became symbols of divine justice. And while the body writhed, the sermon reminded the people that suffering was the price of purity. Every fracture was a word, every scream, a verse. Pain was ritualized, blessed, offered as a spectacle to a God who, perhaps, never asked for it. But the horror did not always happen outdoors. In the depths of the castles, far from prying eyes, awaited the chair of spikes. At first glance, it looked like a throne, solid, made of oak and iron, but every surface, the backrest, the seat, the armrests, was covered by hundreds of sharp nails. When the prisoner was stripped and tied down, the spikes slowly sank into the flesh. They did not kill. They only reminded of their presence with every breath. The pain was constant, exact, almost mathematical. In some places, the executioners lit braziers under the chair. The heat rose, the metal expanded, and the burning point seared the skin from the inside. Records speak of bodies that remained for hours in that impossible posture, unable to move, to scream, to die. The inquisitors watched in silence, measuring time as an alchemist measures temperature. Their goal was not punishment, but conversion. They hoped that, in the midst of torment, the soul would yield and confess its error. In Germany and Italy, there were even more refined versions, with screws in the headrests to secure the forehead and jaw, with clamps on the ankles to completely immobilize the prisoner. The purpose was to eliminate any possibility of escape, even of thought, because when the body cannot move, the mind becomes its own prison. The inquisitor who observed that scene did not see himself as a monster. He believed he was serving a higher good. In his twisted logic, pain was the path to truth. And that made him even more dangerous. Cruelty without faith can grow tired, but cruelty with a purpose perfects itself. That is why the Inquisition became an almost scientific system of soul control. Every instrument designed not only to torture, but to convince. The wheel taught the people what happened when the church was defied. The chair taught the prisoner that there was no escape, not even in their own body. They were two sides of the same coin, the power that punishes and the power that tames. And while the fire crackled or the iron cooled, the message was etched into all who watched. Pain was the language of order. Centuries later, thinkers like Michel Foucault would write that public punishment did not seek justice, but demonstration. They were right. The Inquisition understood before anyone else that suffering, when seen, becomes pedagogy. In every execution, there was an audience, a script, a moral. It was a sacred theater where the spectator learned to be afraid, and fear was the most solid foundation of power. In the dusty archives of Toledo and Seville, meticulous drawings of artifacts appear with almost innocent-sounding names: the thumbscrew, the Spanish boot, the knee splitter. But those names hide a cold precision, typical of a watchmaker of pain. In those pages, torture is described with the same meticulousness with which a craftsman notes down measurements and proportions. The human body was a map, and the inquisitors knew exactly which part they had to break to obtain obedience. The thumbscrew was a small device the size of a hand, consisting of two metal plates joined by a central screw. The prisoner's fingers or thumbs were placed between them. With each turn, the plates drew closer, crushing flesh, bone, and nails. Some models had inward-facing spikes that tore the skin before the bone even cracked. It didn't take much. The sound alone was enough to break the mind. Often, the accused confessed before feeling the first full turn, just from hearing the screech of the tightening metal. It was an intimate, almost silent torment. The pain was concentrated in a tiny spot, but its echo expanded throughout the entire body. Further down the hierarchy of the inquisitorial hell was the Spanish boot, an iron structure that embraced the legs from the ankle to the knee. Once secured, the executioners would insert wooden or metal wedges between the plates and the skin, striking them with a hammer. Each blow drove the wedge a little deeper, crushing muscles, tearing nerves, and shattering the bones of the tibia and fibula. The noise of the hammer mixed with the screams formed a macabre rhythm, a psalm of suffering. In more advanced versions, the wedges were replaced by screws that could be turned slowly, prolonging the agony for hours. It was said that the knee splitter was reserved for the obstinate, those who still denied everything after all else. It consisted of two toothed plates lined with internal spikes. The executioner placed a knee between them and turned a screw until the spikes penetrated the flesh. With each turn, the bones shattered into fragments, the kneecap turned to dust, and the ligaments snapped like broken ropes. No one who suffered it ever walked again. But the most disturbing part was that it rarely killed. The prisoner was left alive, crippled, turned into their own warning. The pain did not extinguish. It settled in. Even more feared was the head crusher, a metal structure with a base for the chin and a top plate that descended slowly as a screw was turned. First the jaw cracked, then the teeth, then the facial bones. If the inquisitor continued, the skull itself began to compress. Some devices had spikes on the inside of the plates to increase the torment, so that even before total collapse, the skin was already bleeding from dozens of puncture wounds. In the reports, it was noted with cold serenity. The accused confessed after 3 turns of the screw. All these instruments shared something more than their brutality, a precise logic. They were not made to kill, but to keep the condemned alive long enough to produce a confession. In that technical perversion lay the genius of inquisitorial terror. The executioners were engineers of the limit, calculating how much a body could withstand without dying. It was a science of suffering, where pain was dosed out like medicine. And while bodies were destroyed, minds were broken with equal efficiency. Because in that basement, they were not looking for the truth, but for surrender. The inquisitor did not need evidence or witnesses. He only needed a voice to say yes. And when the prisoner said it, with a swollen tongue or broken teeth, the tribunal noted, the accused spoke freely. If one observes those machines in museums today, gleaming under artificial light, they seem almost harmless. But what made them fearsome was not the iron, but the intention. They were not created by madmen, but by men convinced that pain could serve God. And that conviction, that moral coldness, is what makes the Inquisition a disturbing mirror of humanity. Because even now, centuries later, we continue to design our own versions of the thumbscrew. Laws, media trials, invisible pressures. They no longer break bones, but they do bend wills. The iron has changed shape, but the purpose remains the same: to subjugate in the name of truth. Among all the torments, there was a category reserved for a type of crime that the Holy Office considered especially repugnant: the disobedience of the body. In the records, they are grouped under terms like impurity, lust, adultery, and witchcraft. But behind those seemingly religious words hid another intention: the absolute control of the human body, especially the female body. Because for the Inquisition, the body was the door through which sin entered, and through which it had to be punished. The most feared instrument in those cases was the Spanish spider, also called the breast ripper. It was an iron tool with curved claws, sometimes 4, sometimes 6, ending in sharp points. They were heated red hot before being driven into the flesh. Chronicles relate that they were used primarily against women accused of witchcraft, adultery, or sexual heresy. The executioner, with a sharp pull, would tear off skin, muscle, and sometimes the entire breast. In theory, it was not a lethal punishment. In practice, it was an execution by sanguination and humiliation. The inquisitors called it moral correction. The symbolism was perverse. The breast, associated with motherhood and life, became the site of punishment. The Inquisition destroyed what represented creation, and it did so in the name of purity. Physical pain was only one part of the ritual. The true wound lay in the public dishonor, in the gaze of others. Because every mutilation was also a message. The body belongs to the authority, not to the one who inhabits it. Alongside the spider existed another smaller, but equally infamous instrument: the pear of torment, or pear of anguish. At first glance, it looked like a polished metal fruit, with segments that opened by turning a screw. It was inserted into the mouth, rectum, or vagina, depending on the type of sin. Then the executioner slowly turned the mechanism, and the sections expanded, tearing from the inside. Records mention that it was used in France, Germany, and Italy, although its fame spread throughout Europe. Whether real or not, in all cases, the pair embodied the darkest imagination of punishment: intimate, invisible pain, directed at the place where shame and pleasure blur. Another of the most humiliating devices was the Judas cradle. A tall tripod crowned by a pointed pyramid, the condemned was suspended by ropes and lowered slowly until the point penetrated their flesh. The body's own weight did the rest. Some inquisitors called it the balance of the soul, because the prisoner had to maintain constant tension to avoid sinking further. Sessions could last hours, even days. Sometimes weights were added to the legs to accelerate the descent. No one came out of there intact. But the worst part was not the wound, but the exposure. The naked body, suspended, reduced to an object. And if the Judas cradle was not enough, the wooden horse awaited, a sharp, wedge-shaped beam, which the accused had to straddle naked. The executioners tied stones to their feet to increase the pressure. The wood slowly cut the skin, tearing the thighs and the crotch. The punishment could drag on for hours, even days. In some places, it was used against soldiers for indiscipline, in others, against indecorous women. In all cases, the message was the same. Suffering purifies what desire corrupts. The Holy Office turned sex into a battlefield. The flesh was a temptation that had to be subdued, and pleasure, an enemy of the faith. Thus, sexual torments not only punished the sin, but staged it. The inquisitor transformed into a priest of modesty, the executioner into a preacher, and the humiliated body became a sermon. Many of these methods were described centuries later as exaggerations or even as inventions. But although some forms may have been magnified by legend, the principle behind them is undeniable. The Inquisition used modesty as a tool of control. It understood that shame can hurt as much as iron. That humiliation, when repeated before a crowd, leaves deeper scars than any wound. And that logic, in one way or another, survives. Today, claws are no longer heated and wheels are no longer raised. But we continue to punish bodies that do not conform to the norms. We continue to judge with the same mixture of fear and desire. The history of the spider, the pear, and the horse does not belong only to the past. It is a dark mirror where our own obsessions are still reflected. Among all the instruments of the Holy Office, none symbolizes the word confession better than the rack, also known as the torment of the rope. It was a simple structure, a long wooden bench with rollers at the ends. The prisoner's wrists and ankles were tied to each of them. The executioner slowly turned a crank, tightening the ropes that ran across the body. Bones stretched, muscles tore, and tendons snapped with a sound that many witnesses compared to a dry branch breaking. Each turn was a question, each snap an answer. In the archives of Valladolid, there is a written testimony by a 16th century scribe. The accused resisted 3 turns, but on the 4th he asked to speak. He said everything he knew, and what he did not know, he invented. That last sentence, perhaps added with bitterness or lucidity, summarizes the true objective of the rack. They were not seeking the truth, but submission. The important thing was not what the condemned said, but that they spoke. Pain turned the word into obedience, and obedience was the true faith. Some inquisitors added weight to the ankles or struck the ropes between turns to make them vibrate and multiply the suffering. Others left the accused in tension for hours so that the body would slowly collapse. The rack became a ritual of precision, a choreography of strength and fragility. They called it the instrument of truth, as if the truth needed flesh to reveal itself. But when the rack was finished, death did not always follow. Sometimes the final sentence was slower. The hanging cage. It was a wrought iron structure, the size of a man, suspended from a tower or a post in the center of the town. The condemned was locked inside, naked or barely covered in rags, without food, without water, without shelter. By day the sun scorched them. By night the cold froze them. Crows and rats did the rest. The body became a message suspended in the air, a lesson in visual theology. In the diaries of a 17th century French traveler, one reads, "In Seville, I saw a cage with a man who was still breathing. His eyes were open, but he could no longer see. Children played nearby, women crossed themselves, men passed by in silence. It was as if the entire city breathed through his suffering." The cage did not just kill, it educated. It taught the living the price of doubting. And that pedagogy of fear was perhaps the most enduring work of the Inquisition. The tribunal scribes recorded everything. Every session, every blow, every word. But what is most striking when reading those records is not the physical cruelty, but the language. In their sentences, horror is disguised as piety. The accused showed himself to be docile, The condemned confessed with tears of repentance. The soul was purified. Clean words to describe shattered bodies. It was a grammar of pain, and that grammar survived for centuries, repeating itself in other trials, in other prisons, in other ideologies. Many modern historians argue that part of what we know today as torture instruments were exaggerations or myths constructed by the enemies of the Church. But although some pieces may have been embellished by time, the intention to control through suffering is an unquestionable fact. Inquisitorial torture was not just a set of tools, but a mentality, the belief that truth is achieved through fear, that purity is imposed with pain. The rack and the cage were its perfect expression. The first destroyed the individual, the second turned them into a monument. One extracted the confession, the other exhibited it. Together they formed a system of punishment and warning, a moral theater where suffering was the scenography of faith. And as in any theater, there were spectators. The crowd that attended the autos da fe was not innocent. They participated in the ritual with their gaze, because looking is also a form of consent. Centuries later, when the racks were dismantled and the rusted cages fell to the ground, the echo of that spectacle remained alive. In modern prisons, in secret interrogations, in regimes that confuse justice with control, the wheel, the screw, and the rope are no longer there, but their shadows continue to act. The names changed, not the intentions. Thus, in every confession extracted by pressure, in every truth dictated by fear, the spirit of the rack is resurrected a little, because the greatest legacy of the Inquisition is not its irons, but its lesson, that obedience can seem like a virtue, when in reality it is the deepest form of slavery. When the dust of time covered the archives of the Holy Office, many thought the Inquisition had died, that the fire was extinguished, that the screams dissolved into the stone walls. But its legacy did not disappear. It seeped into law, into politics, into faith. The 16th century transformed it into an institution, the 17th into a tradition, the 18th into a disgrace, and the 19th turned it into a myth. However, beneath all those layers, the same principle still beats: the idea that fear can maintain order. Spain emerged from that era divided. In the pulpits, priests spoke of redemption. In the homes, families continued to whisper. The descendants of the condemned learned to hide surnames, to erase traces of their Jewish or Muslim past. Being an old Christian was a shield, but also a chain. No one could prove their purity, only fake it. Thus was born an entire culture of suspicion, an inner vigilance that survived long after the last autos de fe. The inquisitors themselves left an ambiguous legacy. Some ended up repentant, others were venerated as saints. In their writings, prayers are mixed with torture manuals, supplications with rope measurements. That duality, the executioner who prays, the believer who destroys, is perhaps the most accurate portrait of the human soul when it surrenders to limitless power. They were not demons. They were men convinced they were saving souls. And that conviction, more than fire or iron, was the true flame of hell. Today, the museums of Europe exhibit their instruments as relics of horror. In glass display cases, visitors observe the wheel, the rack, the spider, the pair of anguish. Some feel repulsion, others fascination. But few understand that they are not looking at the past, but at a mirror. Because the Inquisition was not just an era, it was a way of thinking. And that way still persists everywhere truth is imposed by force, where difference is punished, where silence is worth more than justice. In universities and history books, it is debated whether all those devices were actually used as described. There is debate over numbers, exaggerations, propaganda. But the academic debate does not change the essential fact. The Inquisition existed, and so did its method. Perhaps the iron was less frequent, but the humiliation, the censorship, and the fear were universal. Power discovered that it did not need fire if it could dominate the mind. In a way, the Inquisition perfected the most enduring torture, that of the guilty soul. For centuries, generations grew up with a fear of making mistakes, a fear of doubting, a fear of thinking differently. That fear, cultivated under the sign of faith, survived all kings and popes. And even today, when an attempt is made to impose a single truth, whether religious, political, or moral, The echo of that machinery vibrates once again. Close your eyes and imagine entering an ancient tribunal chamber. The torches no longer burn, but the air still retains its density. The cold stones seem to absorb the sound of your footsteps. In one corner, a rope hangs from the ceiling. In another, a table with deep marks. There are no bodies, but there is a presence. If you listen closely, you can almost hear a murmur. Broken prayers, extracted confessions, supplications that mix with weeping. It is the whisper of power disguised as piety. The Inquisition called its work holy. It claimed to defend purity, to protect the faith. But its greatest legacy was to remind us that even the most sacred ideas can be corrupted when man uses them to dominate. There is no torture more cruel than that which is inflicted believing one is doing good. That is why, every time a government, a religion, or an ideology tries to impose a single form of truth, we must remember the shadow of the rack and the silence of the cage. Because as long as human beings seek to control one another in the name of virtue, the spirit of the Inquisition will remain alive, waiting, disguised as justice. And perhaps that is its eternal punishment. Not the fire it ignited, but the memory it will never be able to extinguish.